Before we begin, sit with this. The lords of the Dreadfort wore cloaks sewn from the skin of their enemies, not as aberration, not as madness, as tradition. For thousands of years this was how House Bolton spoke to the world. Let your breathing slow now. Let the weight of the day begin to soften at its edges. There is nothing you need to solve tonight, nothing you need to hold on to or carry forward. Whatever remains unresolved will remain so until morning, and morning is patient. For now, there is only this, a voice, a story, and the long unbroken dark of the north. We are going back, further than you might expect. Back before the War of 5 Kings, before the Red Wedding, before the name Bolton meant anything to the lords of the South. We are going back to a time when the North was not one kingdom but many, a fractured, frozen world of petty kings and rival blood, where power was not inherited so much as seized and held by force of will and the threat of something worse than death. You find yourself, in this moment of drifting stillness, somewhere cold. The air that reaches your lungs carries the faint edge of pine and frost. The ground beneath your feet is hard. The trees around you are old, older than any name you know for them, and somewhere in the grey distance, beyond a ridge of dark stone and older rock, there is a fortress. Its towers do not reach for the sky with any kind of ambition. They stand instead the way old things stand, patient, enduring, and utterly certain of their own permanence. This is the Dreadfort. And the story of what was built inside it, and what was done inside it, is among the oldest and most quietly terrible in all of Westeros. Hearts. If you would rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. Heart's House. Bolton did not begin in darkness. That is the first thing the histories want you to understand. They began the way most great houses begin, in conflict, in survival, in the particular kind of determination that hardens into dynasty over long generations. But somewhere in those long generations something turned. Something that might have been ruthlessness in another house became, in the Boltons, something more precise and more unsettling, a philosophy. The Boltons were lords of the Dreadfort long before the Starks were kings of Winterfell. That sentence, quiet as it is, carries an enormous weight. It means that the fortress on the banks of the Weeping Water is not a house of recent construction or recent ambition. It is old in the way that grief is old, built into the stone of the earth itself, inseparable from the land around it. The exact founding of the Dreadfort is lost, as so many of the North's oldest histories are lost, buried under winter after winter, under the forgetting that comes with time and isolation. But the maesters who have studied the matter believe that the castle predates the Stark seat at Winterfell by a considerable span, or at least stands alongside it as a rival in age. In those early centuries, centuries so remote that even the broad outlines are disputed, the Boltons were kings. Not merely lords of some swath of northeastern territory, but rulers, self-styled and genuinely powerful. They called themselves the Red Kings. The title was not metaphorical. It spoke of blood, yes, the blood of their enemies, but it also spoke of something older and more ceremonial. The Red Kings of the Dreadfort were defined by a practice that would follow their house across 10,000 years of history like a shadow that cannot be outrun. No matter how far you walk or how brightly the fire burns, they flayed their enemies, and they kept what they took. It is worth pausing on that for a moment, not to linger on the horror of it. And it was horrible, make no mistake, but to understand what the practice meant in the context of ancient northern culture. The Bolton method of warfare was not only physical, it was psychological in a way that the word psychological barely contains. To flay a man was to take from him not merely his life, but his final dignity, the very boundary between self and world, and to wear the result, To drape yourself in the skin of someone who had tried to kill you was to make a particular statement about power, about permanence, and about what it meant to lose. Sit with that thought for a moment. Sit with what it means that a house carried this tradition not for a generation, not for a century, but across millennia. Across the rise and fall of empires, across wars that consumed entire bloodlines, across the long night itself, a darkness so total that it threatened to end everything. The Boltons held on to this practice like a covenant with something ancient. It was not incidental to who they were. It was essential. The question historians have never quite settled is whether the Bolton practice of flaying was adopted from some older tradition, some ritual inheritance from the first men that the Starks and other great houses left behind, or whether it was an invention, the creation of some specific Bolton ancestor who looked at the world through colder eyes than most. What we know is the sigil, a flayed man, pink and raw, and suspended on a field of red. It is the most immediately disturbing sigil among all the great houses, more so than the Lannister lion in its arrogance, more so than the Baratheon stag in its rage. Because the flayed man is not a symbol of strength in any conventional sense. It is a symbol of aftermath. It says, "We have already won. You are already defeated. What remains of you hangs here, on our banner, as evidence of what happened and what will happen again." The Dreadfort itself was built to match this philosophy. It is not a welcoming castle. The architecture of the Dreadfort, dark stone on dark stone, narrow windows that let in almost no light, corridors that descend rather than rise, communicates something specific. It communicates that the people who built it understood fear not as an emotion to be overcome, but as a resource to be cultivated and managed. The dungeons beneath the Dreadfort are, by all accounts, the most elaborate and the most terrible in the Seven Kingdoms. They were not built merely to contain prisoners, they were built to change them. The difference matters enormously. In the ancient canon of Bolton lords, one name stands slightly above the others, though even it is half myth and half memory. An early king whose name the histories render uncertainly, the syllables worn smooth as river stone across such gulfs of time. This early Red King is said to have been the one who formalized the flaying tradition into something almost ceremonial. Not the panicked act of a warrior in battle, but a deliberate and unhurried procedure carried out after the fighting, in the quiet of the Dreadfort's lower rooms, by hands that knew their work and did not rush. Whether this specific lord existed exactly as described is less important than what the story tells us about how the Boltons understood themselves. Every great house has its founding myths. The Starks have Bran the Builder, who raised the wall and Winterfell both, the builder at the edge of the world. The Lannisters have their gold and their founding king, who traded in that gold so shrewdly that the wealth became eternal. The Boltons have a torturer, not in spite of their pride, but as the source of it. The skin-cloaks deserve a particular mention, because they are the detail that most history either glosses past or treats as a footnote, when it deserves to be understood as something central. The lords of the Dreadfort wore cloaks made from the skins of their enemies. The practice was not continuous. There were long periods when it lapsed, when the Boltons accommodated themselves to the sensibilities of their neighbours, but it persisted as a tradition, surfacing and submerging across generations like something that cannot be entirely drowned. The Stark kings, who eventually forced the Boltons to submit to their rule, made the cessation of skin-wearing one of the specific conditions of peace. The fact that this had to be made explicit tells you something important. It had not stopped on its own. The relationship between the Dreadfort and the land around it is worth attending to as well. The forests are dark and close, the rivers cold and fast, the sky in winter sitting lower than anywhere else. It is a landscape that seems, over the centuries, to have accommodated itself to its lords, or perhaps to have shaped them. The frost and the dark and the silence of that northeastern country are, in a strange way, the landscape of the Bolton soul. When you watch the later Bolton lords, Roose and then Ramsay, and you feel the unease they produce, the particular quality of dread that attaches to them unlike any other figures in the great story. It is worth understanding that unease has a root. It is not merely that these men are cruel. Westeros has no shortage of cruel men. The Lannisters are cruel. The Freys are petty and vicious. What is remarkable about the Boltons is the age of their cruelty. The sense that what Roose Bolton carries inside his quiet chest is not a personal pathology but an inheritance, the accumulated weight of thousands of years of a specific kind of power. When Ned Stark looked at Roose Bolton across the table of his war council, he saw a lord, an ally, a man he trusted with the lives of his soldiers. He did not see a Red King. He did not see the 10,000 years of the Dreadfort standing behind those pale, patient eyes. And that gap between what Ned saw and what was actually there is one of the quiet tragedies of everything that followed. Jon Snow, too, when the reckoning finally comes, carries the weight of this history without knowing it. When he stands across the field from Ramsay Bolton on the frozen ground outside Winterfell, he is reenacting something ancient. Stark and Bolton, wolf and flayed man, the old war finding its new form in the bodies of two young men with old blood in their veins. The history did not end with submission. It merely waited. The relationship between the Dreadfort and the land around it is worth attending to as well. The northeast of the north is cold in a way that even the rest of the north finds bleak. The forests are dark and close, the rivers cold and fast, the sky in winter sitting lower than anywhere else. It is a landscape that seems, over the centuries, to have accommodated itself to its lords, or perhaps to have shaped them. The Boltons did not transplant themselves to a hostile environment. They became native to it. The frost and the dark and the silence of that northeastern country are, in a strange way, the landscape of the Bolton soul. There is a term in the older histories. Northern scholars use it occasionally when writing of houses whose identities are tied to specific, difficult territories, that translates roughly as the blood of the land. It describes the way a house, across sufficient generations, stops simply living in a place and begins to express it, to carry the qualities of the soil and the water and the weather into the way it thinks and speaks and governs. The Boltons are perhaps the purest example of this phenomenon in all of Westeros. They are what the northeastern north produces when you cross ambition with isolation and add 10,000 years of winter. The night presses gently now. The cold of the ancient north fades to the edges of the room where you rest. What you have begun to learn tonight is only the foundation, the stone beneath the stone, the first layer of a history so deep it contains multitudes. The Boltons were here before the world you know was fully formed. They will take some knowing. Your body is very heavy now, in the best way. Heavy with the particular weight of someone who has been still long enough for stillness to become its own form of rest. The Bolton story began in winter. It persists through winter. And winter, for all its cold, has always been the condition in which the North finds its truest self. Let that paradox rest with you as the dark deepens and the story waits for morning. But there is no hurry. The Dreadfort will still stand in the morning. The Red Kings will still have lived and ruled and practiced their particular art. The history will keep, as all history keeps, patient and unhurried in the dark. Let your body be heavy now. Let your thoughts begin to lose their edges. The stories will continue. Your watch, for now, is ended. Hearts, if you would rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify. Link in the description. Hearts. But here is the question that haunts every historian who studies the Dreadfort. If the Starks eventually won, why does it feel like the Boltons were never truly defeated? Stay with us now. There is no need to wake. The story is not finished. Let your breathing deepen again. In through the nose, slow, and out through the mouth, slower still. The world you left behind today can wait for morning. Before we can understand the Boltons as history records them in their later, more familiar form, we must understand what they were before history settled, before the Starks consolidated the North, before there was a North to consolidate. We must understand the war. There is a reason the Maester's histories refer to the conflict between House Stark and House Bolton as the 1,000 Years' War. Not metaphorically, not as an approximation, but as a genuine attempt to describe a military and political rivalry that stretched across so many generations it outlasted the people who began it, and became, instead, a structural feature of the North itself, as natural and inevitable as the long winters. Let the weight of that settle. 1,000 years of war. The whole of what the southern kingdoms call recorded history barely spans that span. To understand how a war could last 1,000 years, you must first understand the geography of the North. The North is not a country in any conventional sense. It is a vastness. A man could ride from Winterfell to the Wall and spend weeks doing it. The distance between the Stark seat and the Bolton stronghold at the Dreadfort is not trivial. It is a journey of considerable length, through terrain that does not make travel easy in any season, and in winter makes it nearly impossible. This geography did not prevent the war, but it gave the war a particular character. It was not the kind of war that ends in a single decisive battle, with armies meeting on an open field and the matter settled in an afternoon. It was the kind of war that lives in raids and counter-raids, in the burning of granaries and the killing of small folk, in the taking of castles and the losing of them again before winter comes. It was, in the truest sense, an endurance competition. And the Boltons, who had been living with endurance as their primary skill for as long as the Dreadfort had stood, were in some ways better suited to it than anyone else. The early phases of the conflict were not between equals. In those first centuries the power was genuinely balanced. The Starks held the southwest of the north, the land around what would become Winterfell, the fertile valleys and the connections to the broader world. The Boltons held the northeast, darker, colder, more isolated, but theirs absolutely. Between these two spheres the other lords of the north aligned and realigned, shifted their loyalties and their marriages, calculated the odds and chose their sides with the particular pragmatism that survival requires. The Bolton advantage across this long contest was psychological. Even when the Starks had more men, even when they had tactical superiority or better weather, or simply better luck, the Bolton name carried something that could not be countered with any army. Fear is not a military resource that appears in any serious tactical analysis, but it matters. It matters enormously. The lords of the Dreadfort understood this before most kingdoms in the world understood it. Lords who feared the Bolton method, the methodical flaying, the dungeons that did not simply end a man but transformed him, allied with the Boltons not because they admired them, but because the alternative was to become an enemy of them. Here is the thing worth sitting with for a long while. 1,000 years is not an abstract measure. It is not a number that simply sits in a text and means large. 1,000 years is 40 generations of men and women who were born into a war, who lived inside it, who married within it, who had children who would continue it, and who died before it ended. Not one person who began the 1,000 Years' War lived to see its conclusion. What does it do to a culture to exist inside a conflict of that duration? What does it do to a family, to a house, to a bloodline? The Boltons who finally submitted to the Starks were not the Boltons who first raised their banners against them. They were the product of all those intervening generations, each one shaped by the generation before it, each one inheriting not just the war but the identity that the war created. To be a Bolton, by the time peace came, was not simply to belong to a particular family. It was to carry a particular understanding of what the world was, an understanding forged in a millennium of specific repeated violence. This is the thing that the great houses of the South, the Lannisters and the Tyrrells and the rest, who see the North as merely cold and far away, could never quite grasp. The North's internal history is ancient in a way that Southern history is not. The wars of the South are recent. The houses of the South are recent. The Lannister dynasty, for all its gold and its pride, is a newcomer in comparison to what Stark and Bolton represent. When these two houses finally ceased fighting, They carried between them a weight of mutual history that was older than most of the other civilizations that Westeros knows by name, and the peace, when it came, did not erase that weight. It compressed it. Like water pressing through stone, the resentment and the memory and the identity forged in conflict did not disappear simply because the swords were sheathed. It went underground. It became the particular quality of Roose Bolton's eyes, pale, still, seeing. And then, much later, the particular quality of Ramsay Bolton's smile. The war never truly ended. It only changed form. Your breathing is calm now. You have heard something true tonight, something worth knowing. The cold of those old centuries is not in this room with you. Let it stay where it belongs. We go now into the small and specific, the texture of how this war was fought. Among the many engagements of the 1,000 Years' War, there are a handful that have survived in the historical record with enough detail to suggest something of the texture of the conflict. The battle at the Weeping Water, the river that runs near the Dreadfort itself, is recorded as one of the earliest major confrontations, a clash that took place in what the histories simply call the Ancient Period, a time before the genealogies are reliable or the years are firmly established. In this battle, a Bolton king, nameless to us now, known to the chroniclers only as the Red King of the East, is said to have repelled a Stark army 3 times his own size by holding the riverbank through a winter that neither side expected to last as long as it did. The Stark forces, better provisioned and more numerous but less adapted to that particular northeast cold, withdrew. The Bolton king held the Weeping Water. The cold was his ally in a way it could never quite be for anyone else. Subsequent generations of both houses remembered this engagement differently. To the Starks, it was a strategic withdrawal, a temporary delay in the broader campaign. To the Boltons, it was proof of something they believed in their bones, that endurance, in the end, defeats strength. That the man who can wait longer, who can bear more, who can transform suffering from something that weakens him into something that makes him harder, that man will be standing when the others have retreated or fallen. This philosophy runs through everything the Boltons built and everything they became. It is there in the design of the Dreadfort, which is not built for beauty or for welcome but for survival under siege. It is there in the practice of flaying, which is, if you look at it coldly, a form of endurance taken to its logical extreme, a statement that the Bolton body can bear to witness things that other men cannot. It is there, much later in Roose Bolton's stillness, in the way he moves through a room without appearing to move. An entire 1,000 years of war had, through the mechanism of dynasty and blood and inheritance, produced a man who was himself a kind of fortress, closed, patient, waiting. The trees along the Weeping Water are old. They were old when that nameless Bolton king stood among them and held the line. Some of them, the oaks and the pale weirwoods at the river's edge, may still be standing. The river still runs. The cold still comes every year, faithful and indifferent, the most ancient presence in any landscape. When Robb Stark rode south with his armies, in the early days of the War of 5 Kings, full of justice and momentum and the particular confidence of a young man whose cause is genuinely right, he brought Roose Bolton with him. He trusted Roose Bolton with the command of a significant portion of his forces. He gave this man a seat at the table where decisions were made that would determine the fate of the North, and Roose Bolton sat there, patient as the Weeping Water, patient as the Dreadfort stone, and waited. Robb never knew he was fighting the 1,000 Years' War. He never knew that the man across the table from him was not merely an ally with a strategic mind, but the heir to a millennium of waiting, the product of a civilization-long grudge compressed into one quiet, pale-eyed man who had spent his entire life calculating the precise moment when the balance might finally tip. The seasonal patterns of the war deserve mention as well, because they tell you something about how both houses adapted to fighting in a place where winter is not an inconvenience, but a strategic force in its own right. The long northern winters, which could last years, created a cycle that shaped the war's rhythm. The fighting intensified in the brief summers, when movement was possible and supplies could be gathered, and contracted in the winters into something smaller and more personal. Raids on granaries, the cutting of supply lines, the targeted removal of key individuals rather than the broad movement of armies. This pattern meant that the war developed its own internal culture, a set of understandings shared across both houses about how the conflict would be prosecuted in different seasons. It became, in a strange way, a managed rivalry, a permanent state of low-level hostility punctuated by periods of more intense engagement, with both houses developing institutional knowledge of each other that, over time, became almost like kinship. The Starks knew the Boltons knew the Starks. They knew each other in the intimate way of adversaries who have spent a very long time studying the same opponent, the tragedy of Robb Stark, and it is a genuine tragedy, one of the deepest in the great story, is not that he was foolish. He was not foolish. He was, in many respects, the best of his father's qualities refined and clarified, honourable, decisive, clear in his loyalties. The tragedy is that he was fighting in a game whose true history he did not know. He knew that House Bolton was his bannerman. He did not know that House Bolton had spent 1,000 years learning to outlast a Stark. Jon Snow, who comes later and understands more than he is usually given credit for understanding, has a different relationship with what happened. Jon carries the wound without knowing all the reasons for it. When he looks north, and Jon Snow always looks north, back toward the home he has lost and the people who were taken, there is in that gaze something that rhymes with what the Starks always knew about the Boltons, that they are there, in the cold, patient and enduring. The wolves lost the north, but wolves can run a long way and still come home. The Long War has grown quieter now. The armies have dissolved into the dark and the cold, and what remains is the story. The long, slow story of two houses, and what it means to outlast each other across time. You have learned something tonight that few people stop to understand, that the worst betrayals in the great story are not sudden accidents. They are the product of something ancient, something that has been building for longer than any living person can remember. Let that understanding rest with you gently as your eyes grow heavy. You do not need to hold it tightly. It will keep. The night is long and patient, as the North has always been. Your watch, for now, is ended. And yet, after 1,000 years, the Bolton kings did what seemed impossible. They surrendered. The question is, did they ever truly mean it? Breathe slowly now. Let the story settle around you, like the quiet that comes after a long wind has passed. There is something deeply restful about the end of a war, even a war as old and cold as the one between Stark and Bolton. In the hush that follows great conflict, there is space to hear things that the noise of battle covers. We have come now to one of the most significant moments in the history of the North, a moment so consequential that everything that follows in the story of House Bolton, including the Red Wedding and everything it unleashed, must be understood in its light. It is the moment that the Red Kings of the Dreadfort stopped being kings. Let your body settle more deeply into stillness now. Your hands can rest, your shoulders can lower. The weight of the world which you have carried through a long day can be placed gently aside. What you're listening to tonight is ancient enough that you can hear it from very far away, from the comfortable distance of your bed, with nothing required of you except the willingness to let the story enter and move through you like a breath. The submission of House Bolton to the Starks of Winterfell was not a single event. It was a process, a negotiation that took place across time and through violence, a gradual and painful compression of pride into something that could pass from the outside for loyalty. The specific Bolton king who finally bent the knee to a Stark is not named with certainty in any surviving record. This in itself is significant. The maesters who compiled the histories of the North, working as always with fragmentary sources and the natural erosion of time, were able to reconstruct the broad outlines of the submission, but not the individual face of the moment. The man who surrendered the Bolton claim to northern kingship is known, if at all, only as the last Red King, a title that managed to be both accurate and elegiac at the same time. The conditions of the peace between Stark and Bolton have been partially preserved. The Boltons were permitted to retain the Dreadfort and all the land surrounding it. They were allowed to keep their military strength, their household guard, their fortress, their name. What they gave up was sovereignty, the right to call themselves kings, the right to wage war independently, the right to collect taxes and render judgment without reference to Winterfell. They became bannermen. The word does not capture what it cost, and there were other conditions more specific and more revealing. The wearing of skin-cloaks in public or ceremonial contexts was specifically prohibited. The construction of new dungeons in the Dreadfort was to be reported to the Stark Lords. A maester was to be installed in the Dreadfort, a maester being, among other things, a link to the broader web of knowledge and observation maintained by the Citadel, and therefore a set of eyes that the Starks could trust. Each of these conditions tells you something. The prohibition on skin-cloaks says, you must not perform your identity publicly. The reporting requirement on dungeons says, we know what you do down there, and we are watching. The Master says, you will not be isolated, you will not be opaque, you will be embedded in a network that we control. Taken together, these conditions amount to a very specific kind of defeat. Not the defeat of the body, but the defeat of the self. The Boltons accepted all of it. They folded each condition away with the same stillness they brought to everything, the same quality of patient compression that the 1,000 Years' War had installed in their character like a second skeleton. They accepted and they waited. Hearts. If you would rather listen with your eyes closed, find us on Spotify, link in the description. Hearts. We should sit with this for a moment. The nature of forced submission, what it does to a culture, to a dynasty, to the self-conception of a people who have defined themselves by their independence and their particular form of power, is not a subject that history treats with enough care. Historians tend to mark the moment of submission and then move on, tracking what happens in the aftermath without pausing to ask what the submission itself felt like from the inside. The Boltons, in bending the knee, were not simply accepting a political arrangement. They were accepting a story about themselves, a story in which they were not kings, had never truly been kings, were lords in the service of another house, and therefore diminished. For a house that had based its identity on the possession of something other men did not have the stomach for, this was a peculiar kind of humiliation. They could not be stripped of their castle or their land. They could not be stripped of their blood. But they could be stripped of their meaning, of the narrative that explained what they were for. The result, across the centuries that followed, was something that the histories struggle to name. It was not rebellion, not openly. It was not submission, not truly. It was something in between, a surface performance of loyalty that concealed, in the deeper chambers where such things are kept, a profound and patient resentment. The Boltons served the Starks. They sent their sons to fight in Stark wars. They sat at Stark tables and raised Stark toasts, and underneath all of it, they remembered. The North remembers. It is the Stark motto, the Great Declaration. But the Boltons remembered too, in their own way, with their own purposes. This underground resentment is not a simple thing, and it does not express itself simply. It was in the way the Dreadfort continued to be built according to the Bolton philosophy, adding rooms that the reporting requirement made awkward but not impossible, maintaining practices that the spirit of the agreement prohibited and the letter did not quite reach. It was in the careful selection of which Stark commands to follow promptly and which to respond to slowly, with complications and delays. It was in 100 small, quiet acts of self-preservation that, taken together across generations, kept the Bolton identity alive beneath the surface of their loyalty. The generations between the submission and the War of Five Kings are not well documented in the popular telling of the great story, and that invisibility is its own kind of information. The Bolton lords of the Middle Period appear in the histories as loyal bannermen of no particular distinction. They fight in Stark wars, they attend Stark councils, their sons occasionally marry into neighbouring houses. They are, to the external record, unexceptional, a great house in quiet service, as is proper. What the external record does not show, cannot show by its nature, is what was happening inside the Dreadfort. The dungeons continued to be used. The practice of flaying, while no longer displayed publicly, did not disappear. It became private, internal, a thing kept behind the Dreadfort's walls rather than worn on the Dreadfort's lord. This distinction is important. The Bolton lords learned, through centuries of practice, to perform normalcy without abandoning themselves, to present one face to the world while maintaining another in the dark. This capacity, to be two things at once, to hold a public self and a private self in parallel with no apparent strain, is the defining psychological characteristic of the Bolton lords in their mature form. It reaches its fullest expression in Roose Bolton, who is in many ways the ideal product of everything those centuries of hidden identity produced. Roose is, on the surface, a careful and competent lord, a good administrator, a strategic military mind. These things are genuinely true of him, but they coexist with something else, something that the centuries of Bolton identity maintained in secret have made perfectly ordinary within him. When Ned Stark sent his children to foster or to train, when he assigned his trusted lords to their positions and built his administration with the care of a man who genuinely believed in good governance, in all of that building Ned saw Roose Bolton and saw a tool, a capable instrument of Stark policy in the northeast. He's not wrong to see this exactly. Roose Bolton is capable. He is effective. The role of the Maester installed in the Dreadfort is worth examining in some detail, because it reveals something specific about how the Starks understood the problem they were trying to manage. A Maester is not merely a healer and a record keeper. He is a link in the chain of information that the Citadel in Old Town maintains across the Seven Kingdoms. He sends ravens. He receives ravens. He is, in the most practical sense, a node in the network through which the great houses of Westeros communicate with each other and with the larger world. Installing a Maester in the Dreadfort was installing a window, a permanent aperture through which Winterfell could observe what was happening inside the castle that it could not fully control. The Boltons accepted this, as they accepted everything. But the Maester they received was a man who would, over time, become as much a feature of the Dreadfort as the stone itself, adapted to it, shaped by its silences, inevitably more loyal to the lords of the castle than to the chain he wore. This is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the history of the Citadel's relationship with difficult houses. The Maester sent to observe becomes, through long residence and the natural human tendency toward accommodation, something closer to an instrument of the house than a check on it. The Dreadfort consumed its Maesters the way it consumed everything, slowly, thoroughly, without visible effort. There is a final dimension of the submission worth understanding. What it meant for the ordinary people of the northeastern territories, the small folk who worked the Bolton lands, who paid their taxes to the Dreadfort and looked to its towers for the protection and the justice that the feudal compact promised. Their experience of the Bolton submission was different from the political and military experience of the lords involved. For them, the change was superficially minimal. The lord in the Dreadfort was still the lord in the Dreadfort. The taxes still came due in autumn. The winters still came. But there was now, on paper, a higher power to which appeal could theoretically be made. The Starks of Winterfell, who had sovereignty over the entire north, and who were, by reputation, more concerned with the welfare of their small folk than the Boltons had ever been. Whether that theoretical appeal ever functioned in practice, across the isolated terrain of the northeast is a question the histories do not answer clearly. But it existed. The submission, whatever it cost the Boltons, gave the people beneath them something they had not had before, the distant possibility of recourse. But what Ned could not see, because the centuries had hidden it so thoroughly, was that Roose Bolton's competence was never Stark competence. It was Bolton competence, a thing with its own purposes, its own history, its own long memory of what had been taken and not forgotten. Ned trusted Roose the way you trust a structure that appears sound, because it has held weight before, and because there is no obvious sign of the crack running through it. Robb Stark, who inherits his father's trust in his bannermen, along with everything else, carries Roose Bolton north and south with him through his war, and sees, at every step, the face that the Boltons have been presenting to Starks for centuries, loyal, competent, reliable. The face beneath that face, the face of the Red Kings, the face of the 1,000 Years' War, was always there, but it was not the face that was presented at the council table, and Robb, like his father and his grandfather before him, did not look beneath it. The submission happened. The knee was bent, the crown was surrendered, and the Bolton lords went home to their dark fortress on the Weeping Water, and began the long, unhurried work of remembering who they were, beneath the service they were now required to perform. Peace has its own weight, as heavy in its way as war. The weight of the peace between Stark and Bolton settled into the stone of the Dreadfort and remained there, pressing down through the floors into the ancient rooms beneath, where the weight of all Bolton history gathers and waits. Let your body grow heavier now, settling into the warmth beneath you. The old castle is far away. The cold of that old resentment cannot reach you. Your watch, for now, is ended. To understand House Bolton, you must first understand the castle they built, not for comfort, not for beauty, but as a statement, in stone, about what they believed a fortress was truly for. There is nothing you need to remember right now. The night has its own texture, cool and still and without demand. Let the sound of your own breathing fill the small space between wakefulness and sleep. You are drifting, and drifting is exactly right. We're going to a specific place tonight. Not a battlefield, not a throne room, not one of the grand stages on which the great events of the story play out. We're going to a building, to a castle that most people in Westeros know only by reputation, only by the fear that its name produces in the back of the throat, the way a cold wind produces something involuntary, the Dreadfort. The word fort in its name is, in a sense, the most honest word in the name. It is indeed a fortress, defensive in the first and most essential meaning of the word, built to hold against force, designed to make the taking of it as costly as possible. But the word dread is the other half, and dread is not a tactical term. Dread is an emotional term. Dread is what you feel when you approach something and your body knows before your mind does that this is not a safe place, that the air here has been changed by what has happened in it, that the walls remember more than they are willing to say. The Dreadfort is a building that remembers. The Dreadfort sits on the south bank of the Weeping Water, that fast and cold river that runs through the northeastern north like a vein cut in pale stone. The geography of its placement is not accidental. The river provides a natural barrier on the northern and western approaches, making siege from those directions an added logistical challenge for any attacking force. The castle's back, in the most literal military sense, is protected by moving water that in winter becomes treacherous, and in spring becomes a rapid, drowning thing. Only from the southeast does the ground approach with any gentleness, and the Dreadfort's designers, whoever they were, in whatever early century the first stones were laid, made sure that the southeastern approach was the most heavily defended of all. The outer walls of the Dreadfort are notably thicker than comparable fortresses of similar age. At their base, in the sections that have survived the various conflicts and reconstructions of the 1,000 Years' War, they measure nearly 12 feet through, a depth that gives them a quality not quite of walls but of cliffs, faces of dark grey stone that rise without ornament or interruption from the ground. There are no decorative crenellations in the Bolton style, no carved faces or heraldic flourishes worked into the masonry. The walls say one thing: you're not getting through here. The towers are similarly functional. They rise without the tapering grace that characterises southern architecture, the slim spires of Highgarden, or the elegant proportions of the Red Keep. Bolton towers are wide at the base and barely narrower at the top, blunt and purposeful, built for weight and not for beauty. Their windows are narrow, in some cases barely wide enough to admit a bowman's arm, and they face outward, offering very little light to the interior rooms. Inside the Dreadfort, the spatial arrangement reflects the same philosophy of control. The Great Hall is present as in any castle, but it is smaller than one would expect for a fortress of this scale. The Boltons historically prefer to gather in small numbers for intimate purposes, rather than to feast in large public settings. The corridors connecting the hall to the private quarters and then to the towers are narrow enough that two men cannot walk abreast, a feature that limits the movement of large groups within the castle and makes any internal insurrection logistically complicated. Everything in the Dreadfort's interior design communicates the same thing that its exterior communicates: control. Consider what it means to live in a place designed for control, to grow up in corridors too narrow for comfort, in rooms lit by windows too narrow for light, in halls too small for open gathering. The Dreadfort was not merely a military installation, it was an environment, a total environment, one that shaped the experience of everyone within it: servants, soldiers, lordlings, visiting guests, in a particular direction. The direction was always the same, toward the understanding that the Bolton Lord was the centre of the space, the source of whatever order it contained. Children who grew up in the Dreadfort, the Bolton heirs, the pages, the household children of the castle's serving families, grew up understanding something that children in warmer and more open settings do not learn in the same way: that space itself can be an instrument of power, that a room can be designed to make you smaller, that a corridor can be built to make you aware of your own exposure. The Dreadfort teaches this lesson from the very first years of life, and it teaches it so consistently and so completely that it becomes invisible, becomes simply the way things are, the nature of architecture, the ordinary shape of the world. This is how ideology perpetuates itself across generations without requiring explicit instruction. The children of the Dreadfort did not need to be told that control was the highest value, that power resided in the management of other people's fear, that the correct response to uncertainty was to create certainty through force of will and force of environment. The building itself taught them this every day, through the simple facts of its dimensions. Here is the thing worth pausing on. The Dreadfort was not designed to be a place of suffering. It was designed to be a place of order. The suffering, where it occurred, and it occurred often in those lower rooms, was incidental to the order, a byproduct of the lengths to which the Bolton philosophy was willing to go to maintain it. This is a crucial distinction. Houses that are simply cruel produce different kinds of men than houses whose cruelty is embedded in a larger framework of genuine belief. The Boltons were not casually cruel. They were systematically committed to a vision of power that made cruelty, in specific circumstances, logical. Let your breath be easy now. The cold stone of the Dreadfort is far from this room. The dungeons of the Dreadfort deserve particular attention, because they are, even among the dungeons of the Seven Kingdoms, which are not, as a category, places known for comfort, remarkable. They extend deeper beneath the castle than the dungeons of most comparable fortresses, reaching down through the stone of the river bluff into what feels, at the lowest levels, like the very bedrock of the earth. The air at these depths is cold in a way that is not simply the cold of winter, but the cold of permanence, the cold of stone that has not felt direct sunlight in centuries, that has reached a temperature equilibrium with the deep earth, and simply stays there, season after season, indifferent to what happens above. The cells in the deepest levels of the Dreadfort are not designed for execution. This is the fact that the histories circle around without quite landing on directly, perhaps because its implications are somewhat difficult to look at steadily. Cells designed for execution are, in a perverse sense, merciful. They are temporary. They have an end. The lowest cells of the Dreadfort are not temporary. They are designed for duration, for the long maintenance of a living person in conditions that do everything possible to reduce that person, over time, to something other than what they were when they arrived. The Bolton psychology, the particular understanding of human identity and how it can be unmade, found its architectural expression in these rooms. They understood, generations before any systematic study of such things would give it a name, that the self is not fixed. That identity is at some level a practice, something maintained by consistency of environment, of memory, of being addressed by a name, of being recognized as a person by other persons. Remove all of those things systematically over sufficient time, and you do not kill a person. You create something else, something that breathes and moves and responds to commands, but has lost, somewhere in the process, the thread back to who it originally was. This is what the lower rooms of the Dreadfort were for. This is what they did. And when, much later in the great story, we see the results of this process in the form of the man who was once Theon Greyjoy, we are seeing the culmination of an architectural philosophy that is older than anyone living in the story has any way of knowing. Theon Greyjoy arrives at the Dreadfort as a captive in the period following the fall of Winterfell. He arrives as a specific person, flawed, compromised by his own failures, carrying his own particular history of bad choices and complicated loyalties. But he is, at the point of his arrival, still that person. He has a name, he has memories, he has buried under everything that happened a self. The Dreadfort does what the Dreadfort has always done. It works on him. Not all at once. The Bolton philosophy was never about speed, but methodically, over time, with the particular patience that the castle seems to have accumulated in its walls across the centuries of its use. The Great Hall of the Dreadfort is notable in one additional respect, the fireplace. In most castles, the fireplace in the Great Hall is a social feature as much as a practical one, a centre of gathering, a source of warmth and light that draws people together. The Dreadfort's fireplace is functional. It is large enough to heat the room adequately and no larger. It does not draw the eye or suggest a gathering point. The room is arranged so that the Lord's seat is the centre, not the fire. This is a small detail, but small details accumulate in architecture the way they accumulate in personality, into a characteristic stance, a recognizable disposition, a way of being in the world that expresses itself in hundreds of choices that individually seem minor. The great houses of the Seven Kingdoms communicate their values through architecture whether they intend to or not. Highgarden grows upward and outward, all light and openness, the physical embodiment of the Tyrrell philosophy of abundance. The Red Keep perches on its promontory with the specific arrogance of power that believes itself permanent. Winterfell spreads with the pragmatic solidity of a house that has survived every winter the continent has thrown at it, and expects to survive many more. The Dreadfort compresses, it turns inward, it keeps its secrets in its stones. Walk its corridors today if you could, and you would understand the Boltons better than any history could tell you. Better than any account of the 1,000 Years' War, better than any analysis of the Red Wedding. The building knows what it was built for, and it tells you if you have learned how to listen. Sansa Stark, who comes to the Dreadfort's influence later, and through a different door, has a different experience of it. She is not subjected to the full process, partly because she is Sansa Stark, who is consistently underestimated by everyone who encounters her, and who has more interior resources than anyone can see. But she knows the building, she knows what it is for, and the knowledge of it, the cold, functional knowledge of what the Dreadfort has done and what it represents, is part of what makes Sansa, in her later and harder form so careful, so contained, so unwilling to be read. The Dreadfort shapes everyone it touches, even those who pass through it and escape. Once you know what the lower rooms are capable of, you carry that knowledge with you. You cannot put it down. It changes the way you look at every other building, every other room, every other door that might or might not be locked. This is perhaps the Dreadfort's most lasting achievement, not the specific acts committed within it, but the knowledge of what it contains. The Dreadfort stands tonight, as it has always stood, on the bank of its cold river, patient and present and made of something harder than ordinary stone. You have walked its dimensions tonight, the thick walls, the narrow corridors, the deep rooms, and you have understood something of what those dimensions were designed to produce. Let the darkness of the room around you be simply darkness, not the darkness of the lower Dreadfort cells, but the comfortable, ordinary dark of a night that is moving toward morning at its own unhurried pace. You are warm. You are still. Your watch, for now, is ended. If this history speaks to you, subscribe to Factonium, Facts Unlocked. New stories every week. The North's secrets run deeper than one night. The Dreadfort is only stone. What made the Boltons truly feared was not where they lived. It was what they believed. And the practice of flaying was not merely a weapon. It was, in the most disturbing sense, a theology. Let the quiet of the room settle around you fully now. You have been drifting for some time tonight, and the drift is gentle, the way all the best kinds of rest begin. Not suddenly, not all at once, but in the slow easement of the body's constant work of holding itself upright and alert and ready. You can let that work cease now. There is nothing to be ready for. We have been building, over the course of these hours, a picture of House Bolton from the outside. The geography, the fortress, the long history of war and submission. This movement takes us closer. It takes us inside the ideology, inside the specific belief that distinguishes House Bolton from every other great house in Westeros. We are going to approach the practice of flaying not with the desire to recoil, but with the genuine desire to understand. Because when you approach it that way, it reveals something important about what power is, what it was in the ancient North, and why a house that built its identity on this practice persisted for 10,000 years in one of the hardest landscapes in the world. Flaying, as a practice in the Preandal North, was not unique to House Bolton. This is a fact that the popular imagination tends to overlook, because the Boltons are so strongly associated with the practice that it is easy to assume they invented it. But the historical record, fragmentary as it is, suggests that flaying, the removal of skin from a living or recently deceased body, was among the practices of several First Men cultures in the ancient North, carrying ritual and ceremonial significance in contexts that predated the establishment of the great houses as they came to be known. What made the Bolton relationship to flaying distinctive was not, therefore, its origin, but its persistence. Other northern houses, in adapting to the arrival of the Andals and the cultural pressures of the Seven Kingdoms' gradual consolidation, abandoned practices that their neighbours found disturbing. This was pragmatic. Keeping your neighbours comfortable is a reliable way of maintaining peaceful relations, and peaceful relations are generally preferable to the kind of war that costs more than it returns. The Boltons made a different calculation. The Bolton calculation, never stated explicitly in any surviving document, but legible in their choices over centuries, was that the value of the fear produced by their reputation was greater than the value of the goodwill they would accumulate by abandoning the practice. This is a harder calculation than it might appear. Fear, as a political resource, is real and measurable. You can see it in the willingness of neighbouring lords to accommodate Bolton demands, in the speed with which potential enemies opt for alliance rather than confrontation, in the general reluctance of anyone to pick a fight with a house whose methods of dealing with enemies are too well known. But fear has costs. It isolates. It makes alliance negotiations complicated, because the ally you're speaking to is always also a little afraid of you, and a little afraid of what you might do to them if the alliance sours. The Boltons accepted these costs. They accepted them across generations as a feature of their identity rather than a bug to be corrected. And in accepting them, they developed something unique among the great houses of the North, a reputation so specifically terrifying that it functioned as a kind of military force multiplier. You did not need to station Bolton soldiers everywhere. You only needed people to know what the Bolton name meant. Here is the philosophical question worth sitting with tonight, and I want you to sit with it genuinely, not hurry past it into the next piece of information. The question is this: is there a meaningful difference between causing fear and causing suffering, if both are deliberate and if both serve the same political end? The instinct is to say yes. Of course there is a difference. The difference between a reputation and an act. But the Bolton philosophy suggests a different answer. It suggests that the reputation only maintains its power as long as the acts behind it remain real. A house that was known for flaying its enemies but had actually stopped doing so would, over time, find that the fear attenuated, that neighbouring lords, observing the lack of evidence, began to discount the reputation, began to treat it as historical rather than current. The Boltons understood this. They understood it in the way that only a house with a genuinely long institutional memory can understand it. Not because any individual lord worked it out from first principles, but because the practice and the policy were passed down together, the what alongside the why. This is the ideology of House Bolton, stated as plainly as it can be stated, that power resides ultimately in the willingness to do what others will not. That the limit placed on one's own behaviour by empathy or ethical principle is, in political terms, a weakness. That a house without such limits possesses therefore a kind of freedom, a freedom to act where others hesitate, to threaten what others would not carry out, to be, in the most practical sense, more dangerous than any comparable force. It is a coherent philosophy. This is the uncomfortable truth of it. Strip it of its context and its specific content, and it resembles things that have been argued in different forms by political thinkers in many worlds and many times. Power through demonstrated willingness, reputation through action, the maintenance of deterrence through the reality it represents. The Boltons arrived at these conclusions not through political theory, but through 10,000 years of practice. Your breathing is gentle now. Let the philosophy rest where it sits, understood but not troubling, known but not held. It belongs to the Old North. It is not yours to carry. The skin-cloaks deserve their own meditation, because they are the most visceral and most revealing expression of the Bolton philosophy, and because they are the aspect of the Bolton tradition that the histories treat most uneasily, the point where even the most dispassionate academic prose tends to develop a slight strain, a slight resistance. A cloak of human skin is, first, an object. It is made, presumably with considerable skill. The preservation of skin in a form that can be worn requires knowledge of particular techniques, and the fact that the Boltons practiced this across generations implies that the knowledge was maintained and transmitted. Who maintained it, we cannot say with certainty. Whether it was a dedicated craftsman, a tradition within the Bolton household, something passed from lord to heir directly, the histories are silent. What the skin cloak communicates, as an object worn publicly, is layered. It communicates first and most simply that the wearer has the power and the willingness to do this. That is not a small communication. But it goes further. The skin of an enemy is not an abstract representation of that enemy. It is literally the boundary that separated that person from the world, the thing that enclosed their experience of being alive. To wear it is to make a statement about what that person's life and death signified, which is to say, in the Bolton value system, that it signified Bolton power, Bolton continuity, Bolton permanence. There is also a territorial dimension that is easily overlooked. In many ancient cultures, wearing the trophy of an enemy signals not merely victory over that individual, but possession of what that individual represented, their strength, their power, their claim on the world. The Bolton skin-cloaks, read in this light, were not simply trophies. They were assertions of absorption. We have taken not only your life, but everything your life meant to you, and we wear it now as ours. The stark prohibition on the wearing of these cloaks in public, the condition of the peace agreement, makes more sense understood in this context. The Starks did not merely find the cloaks offensive, they found them politically dangerous because they communicated something that the new order of Stark sovereignty could not allow to be communicated. That there was another power in the north, older and more ruthless, that had not been defeated so much as temporarily accommodated. The Boltons stopped wearing the cloaks, they kept making them. The specific moment when a Bolton lord first wore a skin cloak in a formal context, in a court setting, at a gathering of northern lords, where the statement it made would be received by witnesses capable of understanding it, is not recorded with certainty. But the image that the practice produced in the imagination of the North is well documented in the poetry and oral traditions of the northern houses. There are songs from the northern tradition, old songs whose origins predate the Andal arrival, that describe the sight of a Bolton lord arriving at a gathering draped in what the songs call a second skin. The language is always the same, an arrival that silenced the room, a presence that rearranged the emotional atmosphere, a moment in which everyone present understood simultaneously that something had shifted. What shifted was the understood limit of what the room would tolerate. Before the cloak arrived, the limit was where most people had implicitly agreed it was. After the cloak arrived, the limit was wherever the Bolton lord chose to place it. This is the deepest mechanism of the practice, not the immediate shock of the object itself, but the downstream effect on every subsequent negotiation, every subsequent gathering, every subsequent assessment of what House Bolton was and what it was prepared to do. The cloak was the price of admission to a certain kind of understanding. Once you had seen it, you could never again pretend that the world had a floor below which the Bolton lords would not go. And the extraordinary thing, the thing that continues to reward attention, is that this mechanism worked across generations of Bolton lords, including those who never wore a cloak, including those who had made their peace with the Stark prohibition, and operated entirely within the conventional structures of northern lordship. The reputation survived the practice. The fear outlasted the specific acts that produced it. Even Roose Bolton, who was in every visible way a conventional northern lord, who attended councils, who maintained a proper household, who dressed in the sober colours of a serious man, carried the ancestral weight of the cloak in his reputation. People who had never seen a Bolton perform the old practice still felt in his presence the echo of it. That is how thoroughly the identity had been embedded in the house's name. Ramsay Bolton is many things in the great story, a character of almost unwatchable cruelty. But one of the things he is, which is less often examined, is the Bolton philosophy made literal and visible. All the things that the later Bolton lords had learned to keep private, to maintain in the controlled darkness of the Dreadfort's lower rooms, Ramsay makes public again. He hunts people, he displays his work, he uses suffering as a performance, as a statement about his own power and his victims' lack of it. In doing this, he is doing what the ancient Red Kings did. He is wearing his power visibly, making it impossible to look away from. The tension between Roose and Ramsay on this question is, in some sense, the tension between two eras of Bolton philosophy. Roose represents the post-submission Bolton, the house that has learned to internalize its nature, to express its ideology in ways that can pass for normalcy at the right distance. Ramsay represents the pre-submission Bolton, the Red Kings, the skin-cloaks, the public performance of what others prefer to pretend is not happening. Neither is wrong, exactly, within the Bolton value system. They are simply different calibrations of the same fundamental commitment. What ends the Boltons, ultimately, is not that their philosophy is wrong. It functions, by its own terms, very well. What ends them is that they have miscalculated the capacity of the North to absorb the public version of themselves. The North, as it turns out, does remember. It just takes some time to remember clearly enough to act. The skin cloak is back in its dark room now, behind a closed door that you do not need to open tonight. You have understood something tonight about what House Bolton believed. Not merely what they did, but why they did it. The internal logic of a philosophy so old it predates most of the civilization that eventually judged it. Understanding is not agreement. You can hold the knowledge without endorsing what it describes. You can see the shape of the thing without touching it. Let your breath carry you further from the cold northeast now. The watch continues its vigil. Your watch, for now, is ended. And then, after all those centuries of red kings and skin cloaks and the long, slow war, the house produced its strangest creation, a man who was everything his ancestors were, but who felt nothing while being it. You are drifting well tonight. The dark around you is comfortable, broken only by the smallest sounds, a breath of air somewhere, the almost silent conversation of the building settling into its nighttime quiet. There is nothing that needs your attention. You are exactly where you should be. We have been building toward this moment for some time now, through the ancient history of the Red Kings, through the 1,000 Years' War, through the philosophy that shaped everything the Boltons became. All of that history, all of that accumulated weight, flows down through the centuries and arrives at one man in whom the entire edifice of the Bolton inheritance finds its clearest and most unsettling expression. His name is Roose Bolton. He is, in the great story, the Lord of the Dreadfort, the man who reads the War of Five Kings the way a chess player reads a board, not with passion, not with investment in any particular outcome, but with cool, patient attention to the disposition of pieces and the long-range probabilities of each possible move. He's a man who leeches himself as a medical practice, who eats small measured portions and drinks only water, who never raises his voice and who communicates displeasure through something more effective than rage, a quality of stillness so absolute that the people around him feel it like a change in the temperature of a room. Let your own temperature settle now. Let your body find its most comfortable depth. Roose Bolton was born into everything we have been describing: the Dreadfort, the philosophy, the centuries of compressed identity. He grew up in the narrow corridors and the cold rooms and the particular educational environment that the Bolton inheritance provides. Whatever he was before that environment shaped him, the Roose Bolton who appears in the historical record is the product of his house in the fullest sense, not merely carrying the name, but embodying the philosophy so completely that it is impossible to separate the ideology from the individual. His physical appearance, as described by those who encountered him, is consistent and striking in its consistency. He is pale, as the Dreadfort's interior rooms are pale, not with illness, but with an absence of colour that seems almost deliberate, as though the warmth that most people carry in their complexion has been carefully evacuated. His eyes are described, repeatedly and by multiple observers, as the pale grey of dirty ice, cold, flat, seeing without betraying what they see. He speaks quietly, he speaks precisely. He never appears to be in a hurry, regardless of circumstances, and this absence of urgency in a man of his intelligence reads not as slowness, but as a particular kind of confidence. The leeching practice, Roose Bolton's habit of having himself bled by leeches as a regular health measure, a practice based on the ancient belief that removing bad blood would balance the humours, is more than a medical curiosity. It tells you something about how he relates to his own body. He treats his body the way he treats everything else, as a system to be managed, a resource to be maintained at optimum function by methodical and consistent intervention. There is no room in this system for anything spontaneous or uncontrolled. The body is a tool. The tool requires maintenance. The maintenance is performed on a schedule and without sentiment. His marriages tell a similar story. Roose Bolton was married at least twice, and his relationships with his wives were characterized by all available accounts by the same quality of detached efficiency that characterized his relationships with his bannermen and his allies. He required heirs. He selected candidates for the role of producing heirs with the care of a man who is selecting the right instrument for a specific task. He is not cruel to his wives exactly. Cruelty implies an emotional engagement, a reaction that Roose Bolton does not appear to offer. He is simply indifferent to them in ways that most people find more disturbing than cruelty. Sit with this for a moment. There is a category of person, rare, deeply unsettling to encounter, who can inhabit all the outward forms of social life without experiencing the internal states that those forms are supposed to express. Who can sit at a table with other people, make eye contact, respond appropriately to what is said, even display what looks like warmth or humour, while inside experiencing something that is best described as the absence of the thing that connects most people to other people. Roose Bolton appears to be such a person. He is not simply cold. Coldness can be a response to circumstances, a protective habit, a way of managing the risk of loss by limiting investment. What Roose exhibits is something more fundamental, an apparent absence from the ground level of the capacity for the kind of connection that makes other people's suffering feel like a relevant fact. This is not the same as not understanding other people's suffering. Roose understands it very well. He is an extraordinarily perceptive reader of emotional states, because reading emotional states is a useful tactical skill, and Roose Bolton does not neglect useful tactical skills. He understands that Robb Stark loves his men, and he uses that knowledge. He understands that certain lords respond to fear and others to interest, and he calibrates his approach accordingly. He understands suffering with the precision of an anatomist, where it comes from, what produces it, how it can be sustained or intensified or relieved. He simply does not feel it as a cost. The suffering of others is information. It is data. It is, at most, an aesthetic consideration, something to be managed for practical purposes rather than felt as a reason to stop. This is what 10,000 years of the Bolton philosophy, taken to its logical conclusion, produces. A man who has internalized the Bolton relationship to power and suffering so completely that it has become the architecture of his inner life, not a choice he makes each day, not a posture he adopts, but simply the way he experiences the world. Whether this makes him more frightening or less frightening than a more passionate monster is a question worth considering. There is something, in the end, that most people find more disturbing about the cool than about the hot. Let the question settle without demanding an answer. Roose Bolton in the early phases of the War of Five Kings is a figure of remarkable practical effectiveness. He commands the Bolton forces in the Northern Campaign with precision, winning engagements that require real military skill and genuine tactical intelligence. His decisions on the field reflect a mind that processes information quickly, discards the irrelevant with equal speed, and arrives at conclusions that are usually correct, not because he is lucky, but because he is genuinely good at this. The quality that makes him terrifying to observe, once you understand what you are looking at, is that his competence is entirely in the service of his own calculation. Not the calculation of House Bolton as an institution, though he is careful to present it in those terms. Not the calculation of the North's welfare, though he occasionally invokes Northern interests when they align with his purposes, his own calculation. The chess game that Roose Bolton is playing has one player, and that player has been running the simulation since before any of the other figures in the story sat down at the board. His relationship with Tywin Lannister, that other chess player, the one in the south who also sees the board rather than the people on it, is the most revealing relationship Roose forms in the great story. These two men, who have never met at the time their communication begins, recognize each other across the distance. They speak to each other in the language of interest, of practicality, of the calculation that lies beneath the stated motives of the war. They do not need to pretend with each other. They both understand that the question is not who deserves to win, but who will arrange matters most effectively to win. The arrangement they reach, the agreement that will result in the Red Wedding, in the deaths of Robb Stark and his principal bannermen, in the effective end of the Stark military campaign, is not a moment of passion. It is not revenge, not from Roose's side, not exactly. It is a calculation. Robb Stark is a losing investment, and Roose Bolton is transferring his position to the winning side before the value drops to zero. That the transfer involves the violation of sacred hospitality, the murder of a man who trusted him, and the destruction of the house he has served. These are costs, but they are costs that Roose has already priced in, weighed against the benefits and found acceptable. Catelyn Tully, Catelyn Stark, watches Roose Bolton for years and does not see through him. This is worth understanding because Catelyn is not naive. She is a woman who has been navigating the dangerous politics of a noble household since her youth, who understands the games that men play and is often several steps ahead in reading them. She is the one who recognizes the Lannister threat early. She is the one who sees through Littlefinger's performance long before her husband does. The specific way Roose Bolton ate and drank at the table is worth considering as a window into the wider system. He ate small quantities. He drank water, or at most very lightly watered wine. He ate slowly and with apparent attention, the way a careful man eats when he is not eating for pleasure but for maintenance. At a table where other lords drank deeply and spoke loosely and let the wine expand their sense of what was safe to say, Roose remained contained, sober, and entirely aware. He was, in every social situation, the most present and least revealing person in the room. This quality, being maximally present while remaining maximally opaque, is not simply an affectation or a strategy adopted for specific circumstances. It appears to have been how Roose Bolton moved through all of his waking life, consistently and without variation. There is no record of him in a private moment of relaxation, of the mask slipping in a trusted setting, of any context in which the controlled surface showed signs of something different beneath it. Either no such moments existed, or, and this is the more unsettling reading, they did exist but were invisible to observers, because the surface and the interior were, for Roose Bolton, genuinely the same thing. There was nowhere beneath the surface to go. The quietest and most persistent myth about Roose Bolton is that he was, despite everything, a good ruler of his lands, that the small folk under his administration were better administered than under many lords of similar power. The myth is probably true, not because Roose cared about his small folk in any conventional sense, but because well-maintained small folk are a productive resource, and well-administered lands are a strategic asset. And Roose understood both of these things with the same precision he brought to everything else. Good governance for Roose Bolton was a calculation that happened to benefit the people it governed. But Roose Bolton is something she has not encountered before, a man whose performance is not a layer over a different truth, but simply the entire surface of him. There is nothing to see through, because there is no gap between the face and what lies behind it. The face is the thing, the cool competence, the soft voice, the pale eyes that seem to see everything. These are not a mask. They are Roose Bolton, and precisely because they are real, they are opaque in a way that a mask never quite is. Jon Snow, in the aftermath, will understand something about what happened that Catelyn did not live to understand. Jon understands betrayal from the inside. He will be betrayed himself by his own brothers, stabbed by the men he led, left to die in the snow of Castle Black. And in that experience of betrayal from trusted colleagues, he will understand something about Roose Bolton that is not easily put into words, that the most dangerous traitors are not the passionate ones, not the ones who burn with grievance or ideology, but the ones who feel nothing. The ones for whom betrayal is simply the logical conclusion of a calculation, performed without hesitation and without regret. Roose Bolton is at the table, patient and pale and ready. He has been ready in some sense for 1,000 years. He's the latest expression of everything the Red Kings built into their stone and their practice and their philosophy. The patience, the detachment, the willingness to accept costs that would break a man who was still capable of feeling them as costs. The night is generous with its quiet. Let it cover the image of those pale eyes, and let it fill the space with something warmer, something that belongs to you rather than to the story. You are here, the room is yours, the dark is comfortable, your watch, for now, is ended. Roose Bolton sat in Robb Stark's war council for years. He gave good advice, he fought well, and every day he was writing letters to the Lannisters. The most careful betrayals always look like loyalty, right up until the moment they do not. Let your breathing find its rhythm again. The slow, easy breathing of a body that has given itself permission to rest. You have been carrying a great deal tonight, learning what the North holds in its deep memory. You can set it down now, or rather you can let it settle below the level of active attention, the way all good knowledge eventually settles, into the background of understanding, where it can be available without demanding constant recognition. We have arrived at the war, not the ancient 1,000 years war between Stark and Bolton. That war is over, in the sense that it has concluded, even if its consequences are still running through the veins of the story. We have arrived at a more recent war, the War of 5 Kings, the conflict that broke across the 7 kingdoms when the old certainties of Baratheon rule began to fracture and the great houses turned toward the sudden possibility of power. In this war, every lord in the 7 kingdoms made calculations. That is what war is at its administrative level. A vast simultaneous calculation performed by hundreds of parties, each assessing their interests, their vulnerabilities, their likely returns, and choosing accordingly. Most of these calculations were made with some admixture of loyalty, ideology, personal attachment. The calculation of Roose Bolton was, from the beginning, something purer, something stripped of those elements in the way that a blade is stripped of decoration to be more useful and more dangerous. The War of 5 Kings began with a question of succession, as most wars do at the formal level, whatever the real interests underneath. With the death of Robert Baratheon, the Iron Throne became contested in ways that Robert's reign had made seem unlikely. Robb Stark's entry into the war is the story everyone knows, the beheading of his father, the demand for justice, the gathering of the Northern Bannermen in one of the most emotionally resonant moments in the entire narrative. Robb Stark is 17 years old, and he rides south into a war that he wages with genuine skill and genuine passion, winning engagements that more experienced commanders have lost. Roose Bolton rides with him. This is the crucial fact that must be held clearly in mind throughout everything that follows. Roose Bolton is Robb Stark's vassal, his bannerman, his appointed commander of a significant portion of the northern host. He fights beside Robb. He attends Robb's councils. He receives Robb's trust, not the intimate trust of close friendship, because Roose Bolton does not project the kind of warmth that invites that kind of trust, but the professional trust that a competent commander earns by delivering results. And Roose delivers results. This is essential to understand. His performance in the military phases of the war is genuinely good. He crosses the Trident and takes the Ruby Ford. He manages the northern forces at key engagements in a way that limits casualties among the troops he is personally invested in, while absorbing casualties among forces he finds more expendable. This detail, which becomes clearer in retrospect than it could be in the moment, begins to suggest that Roose's military decisions are not simply about winning the engagement, but about managing the composition of the forces that survive it. Simultaneously, and invisibly from the northern side, Roose Bolton is in communication with the south. The specific timing of his first contact with Tywin Lannister is not established with certainty in the surviving record, but it appears to have begun early, earlier than the defeats that would make such communication seem, in retrospect, understandable. Roose did not wait until Robb's campaign showed signs of weakness before beginning to hedge. He was hedging from the beginning, or close enough to it that the distinction barely matters. The war was always, from Roose's perspective, a set of possible outcomes to be evaluated and positioned for, rather than a cause to be served. Let us sit with the specific mechanics of what Roose Bolton was doing during this period because they are worth understanding not merely as plot, but as a portrait of a particular kind of intelligence. Roose Bolton was maintaining two positions simultaneously. In the northern camp, he was Robb Stark's loyal commander, competent, available, present. In the private channels that led south, he was Tywin Lannister's correspondent, honest, specific, useful. The information he provided to the Lannisters was genuinely valuable. Troop numbers, plans, the emotional state of the Stark leadership, the tensions within the Northern Coalition. He was not providing noise or misdirection. He was providing the real thing. What makes this so remarkable and so characteristic of the particular Bolton intelligence is the stability required to maintain it. Most people engaged in a double game of this magnitude would experience what they were doing as stressful. The fear of discovery, the moral weight of the betrayal, the constant management of contradictory commitments. These things produce, in ordinary psychology, a kind of pressure that tends to find release either in revelation or in collapse. The double agent who cracks, the traitor who confesses, the man who can no longer maintain the distance between what he presents and what he does. Roose maintains it, for years. He maintains it through a grief-stricken Robb Stark planning his next campaign, through councils where decisions are made that Roose is reporting south, through meals and marches and the small human moments that make people feel they know each other. He maintains it the way the Dreadfort maintains its silence, not by effort, but by nature. This is what he is. The two positions are not experienced as contradictory, because for Roose they are not contradictory. They are simply two components of a single strategic reality. The tragedy of everyone around him is that they experience one of these positions and take it for the whole person. Robb sees the loyal commander, Tywin sees the useful informant. Neither can see the total Roose Bolton, because to see the total Roose Bolton you would need to understand that what he presents to any given person is always and only what is useful to present to that person in that moment. Let your body settle now. Let the weight of the story rest for a moment in the dark around you. The specific terms of the Roose Bolton Lannister agreement were negotiated over time through intermediaries and carefully worded messages that could, if intercepted, have been read as ordinary correspondence between lords on opposite sides of a war. The arrangement that was eventually reached was, in essence, simple. Roose Bolton would arrange the end of Robb Stark's campaign, would coordinate the moment and the method with Walder Frey of the Twins, and would in return receive the legitimization of his bastard son Ramsay, the Warden of the North title, and the right to hold Winterfell. Walder Frey's role in the arrangement deserves its own examination, though it is peripheral to the Bolton story proper. The Freys are a different kind of house from the Boltons, more petty, more reactive, motivated by the specific and personal grievance of the slight that Robb Stark offered them when he broke his marriage promise. Where the Bolton betrayal is cold and strategic, the Frey betrayal is hot and personal, a revenge for an insult rather than a calculation about future power. The two houses made compatible instruments, but for completely different reasons and in completely different emotional registers. The violation of guest right, the ancient compact that holds that a host and guest cannot harm each other while bread and salt have been shared, was not something that either Roose Bolton or Walder Frey appeared to weigh heavily in their calculations. Guest right is one of the oldest and most sacred traditions in the culture of Westeros, predating the Andal arrival, rooted in the first men's understanding that hospitality was the foundation of all civil life in a world where you were often dependent on strangers for survival. To violate it was not merely a crime, it was a sacrilege, an act that called down something from the old gods, something that the more superstitious in Westeros believed had real consequences in the world. The Bolton calculation, consistent with everything we have come to understand about that philosophy, found this concern irrelevant. Consequences from old gods were not a data point that Roose Bolton's strategic model incorporated. He was concerned with consequences from people, from institutions, from the material world. The spiritual weight of guest right violation was left to others to carry. What he did not calculate or calculated incorrectly, was the weight of that violation in the memory and the emotional economy of the North. The North's relationship to guest right is not merely cultural, it is foundational, and the wound of its violation was deeper than Roose's model predicted. When the Lannisters receive the news of the Red Wedding, when they understand what has happened at the Twins and what it means for their position in the war, there is a scene of celebration in the South that the great story captures without flinching. The Lannister court receives the news as a gift. The strategic problem of the Northern Rebellion has been resolved. Robb Stark is dead. The war in the North is effectively over. In the North, the response is different. It is a silence. Not the silence of acceptance, but the silence of something so catastrophic that the ordinary emotional vocabulary cannot contain it. The lords of the North who are not at the Twins receive the news and sit with it, and what they sit with is not merely the death of a king, but the death of something they thought was inviolable. Guess right was the rule that held. It was the rule that even the worst wars had not crossed. Its violation says something about what the world has become, something that the Northern lords are still trying to process long after the immediate political consequences have settled. The specific night of the Red Wedding is, in retrospect, a masterclass in the Bolton understanding of timing. Roose did not act as soon as the opportunity presented itself. He waited until the moment was optimal, when Robb's military position had been sufficiently weakened by strategic reverses, when the Frey resentment had been cultivated to the point of action, when the Lannister promises of reward had been made specific and confirmed, every element in place, every piece of the calculation verified. Only then did the evening at the Twins become what it became. This patience, the willingness to wait when a less disciplined actor would have moved earlier, to absorb the uncertainty of the waiting rather than resolve it through premature action, is the distinctly Bolton contribution to the mechanics of the Red Wedding. Walder Frey could have acted against Robb Stark in any number of earlier moments. His grievance was hot and personal. It did not require the precision that Roose's involvement provided. It was Roose who insisted on the specific night, the specific timing, the specific set of conditions that would make the outcome certain rather than merely probable. The patience of the Dreadfort, accumulated across 10,000 years of the Bolton way, expressed itself in the 3 hours before the music changed. Jon Snow, far away at the wall when it happens, receives the news with what the narrative describes as grief of a particular quality, the grief of someone who has lost so much already that each new loss must be compressed and filed away quickly, or it will overwhelm everything. He does not have the luxury of the full response, but it lives in him. The Red Wedding lives in him the way the cold lives in the wall, compressed, persistent, present in every stone. When Jon eventually stands at the head of the coalition that moves south against the Boltons, when he gathers the wildlings and the reluctant northern lords and rides toward Winterfell, there is something in the northern response to him that is not simply political. They are not merely recalculating their interests. They are answering something older. The North remembers. The dead of the Red Wedding remember. When the time comes, the memory acts. The war is still moving, still in motion, the pieces still falling toward the positions they will eventually occupy. But we can rest for a moment here, in the last quiet before the storm of what the story knows is coming. Let your breath be gentle now. Let the story rest at the edge of its most difficult moment, and let your body claim the rest it has been patient about asking for. The night is still and full. You are safe in it. The history is old, and you are only listening. Your watch for now is ended. If these histories of the North speak to you, subscribe to Factonium. Facts Unlocked. New lore drops every week. Stay with us through the long night. What happened at the Twins on the night of the Red Wedding was not simply a murder. It was the end of an era, and it was planned so carefully that even the musicians at the feast were already in position before the first course was served. Stay with the story now. Breathe gently. The night is still, yours and safe, and far from the places we have been describing. There are some parts of the great story that carry a particular weight. a heaviness that lies not in the violence of them but in the significance, the sense that after this moment certain things that were possible before are no longer possible, that the world of the story has been permanently altered in ways that will take a long time to understand. We have arrived at one of those moments. I want to approach it carefully tonight, not with the breathless retelling that the famous scene tends to attract, but from the inside, from the perspective of what it meant within the long history we have been tracing, what it signified in the context of the Bolton story, and what it did to the North as a cultural and emotional landscape. The violence of it is not the most interesting thing. The most interesting thing is what was underneath it, the centuries of calculation and waiting and compressed resentment that made it possible. Let your body be very still now. Let your breath be slow and regular. We're going to pass through this part of the story as through a winter night, carefully, with our eyes open, acknowledging the cold without letting it enter us. The Red Wedding took place at the Twins, the castle of House Frey on the Green Fork of the Trident, on the occasion of the marriage of Edmure Tully, Catelyn Stark's brother, to one of Lord Walder Frey's daughters. The event was designed to heal the breach between House Stark and House Frey that had opened when Robb broke his promise to marry a Frey girl. The feast, the music, the gathered guests, all of it was the scaffolding of reconciliation, the outward form of peace being made. Roose Bolton was at the Twins that night. He sat at the feast. He ate the bread and salt. He participated in the rituals of hospitality that ancient tradition declared inviolable. He would have known, as he raised his cup and made the expected gestures, that the men positioned throughout the hall had their orders. He would have been aware, without showing any sign of awareness, that the musicians were not ordinary musicians. The banners of House Frey were already hidden, rolled up and waiting to be replaced when the moment came. The doors were being positioned to prevent exit. All around the hall, the architecture of what was about to happen was quietly falling into place, invisible to every other person in the room. Catelyn Stark sat at that feast and felt something was wrong. This detail, which the great story captures, is important. Catelyn had survived too much and understood too much to be fully fooled by the surface of events. She looked at Roose Bolton's arm and saw the mail beneath his clothing, the armour that a man wears when he expects violence, not when he is attending a wedding. She understood in that moment what was happening. But understanding something in the instant before it happens is not the same as being able to prevent it. Robb Stark died at the Red Wedding. His bannermen died with him. Grey Wind, his direwolf, the animal that was in some sense his soul animal, the external expression of what he carried internally, was killed in the kennels. The direwolf's head was later sewn onto Robb's body, a final degradation, one last exercise in the theatrical vocabulary of House Bolton's understanding of what power communicates through the treatment of the defeated. We should sit with what was destroyed at the Red Wedding, because it was more than a military campaign. The destruction of Robb Stark and his host was also the destruction of something in the moral universe of the story, a demonstration that the rules which were supposed to govern conflict, the rules that made certain things unthinkable, were not rules at all. They were conventions, sustained by the willingness of most parties to observe them. When a party stopped observing them, when the hospitality was rolled up and the courtesy removed, the conventions were revealed to be nothing more than the absence of someone willing to violate them. The violation of guest right was not merely wrong, it was cosmically wrong, in the understanding of the cultures that the great story has built. The old gods of the first men, who are in the theology of the story genuinely real, genuinely aware and genuinely capable of response, regard guest right as among the most fundamental of human compacts. The weirwoods, with their pale bark and their red leaves and their carved eyes, are said to watch. The green men, the older powers, whatever remains of the magic that once moved more freely through the world of Westeros, all of it, in the story's theology, was watching the Twins that night, and what it witnessed was a transgression of the First Order. This is not merely a spiritual observation, it has material consequences that unfold across the rest of the story. The Red Wedding does not go unanswered. The North remembers, and the memory becomes action, slowly, the way the North does everything, with the patience that the long winters have built into the culture. But it becomes action. The compact that was broken at the Twins begins, from the night of its breaking, to demand something in return. The Bolton lords, in their philosophy, did not account for this. Their model of consequences was human and institutional. What will the Lannisters do? What will the remaining Northern lords do? What are the practical political and military consequences of this action? The model did not include the older kind of consequence, the consequence that moves through the blood and the memory of a people, and eventually, when the circumstances are right, expresses itself through the actions of individuals who may not even fully understand what they are reenacting. Let the thought rest gently. It is not a threat. It is simply a truth about the world the story inhabits. The aftermath of the Red Wedding moves through the North like the cold before a storm, not immediately violent but pervasive, changing the quality of the air. The lords who survive because they were not at the Twins receive the news and are changed by it. Not transformed, not immediately active, but changed in the deep structure way that trauma changes things, altering the relationship to certainty, to trust, to the reliability of the world. The North under Bolton rule following the Red Wedding has a particular atmosphere that the great story captures with remarkable care. It is an atmosphere of surfaces, of people performing their lives while their actual inner states are carefully hidden, of compliance that conceals resentment, of the externally functioning community that carries, at its centre, something broken and waiting. This is what a community looks like when it has been conquered not by a foreign invader, but by the betrayal of someone it trusted. The Northern lords who accept Bolton rule, the ones who bend the knee to Roose as the new warden of the North, who come to Winterfell for his counsels and sit at his table and say the right things, are not, in most cases, actually surrendering. They are surviving. They are doing what the North has always done when conditions are unlivable, enduring, waiting, maintaining the capacity for eventual response. This is the wisdom of the North, cultivated through those very long winters the Starks always warned about. You endure, you conserve, you wait for the moment when endurance can become action. Winterfell itself, under Bolton occupation, becomes a symbol of something very specific. The seat of the Starks has been taken from the Starks. Its walls still stand. The fire that consumed parts of the castle burned many things but did not destroy the fundamental structure. And in their standing they communicate something ambiguous. This place still exists. Therefore, what it represents might still be recoverable. The Boltons understand this symbolic dimension, which is why Roose Bolton makes such deliberate efforts to claim Winterfell not merely physically, but ceremonially, to hold his court there and make it the seat of Bolton power. He's trying to overwrite the symbol. Sansa Stark carries the Red Wedding in her body. She does not witness it directly. She's in King's Landing when it happens, separated from her family, already in the long process of surviving circumstances that would have destroyed someone with less inner resource. The news reaches her as news, not as experience, not as the immediacy of being present, but as the sudden reconfiguration of what her life is now, the removal of the people she might have hoped would eventually come for her. The music is worth a particular pause. The tradition of the Rains of Castamere, the Lannister song written to commemorate the obliteration of a rebellious house, a song that communicates in its very melody something about the consequences of challenging power, was played that night as a signal. Not to the guests, who were still eating and drinking and believing themselves safe, but to the armed men waiting in position around the hall. The choice of that specific song was deliberate. It was chosen because its meaning would be understood, afterward, by everyone who analysed the evening, because it said in musical form the same thing that the Bolton sigil says in visual form, that a house that raised itself against the ruling power has been extinguished, and that the sound of its name should serve as a permanent reminder of that extinguishing. The aesthetic choices embedded in the Red Wedding, the specific song, the removal of the Frey banners and their replacement with the sigils of betrayal, the theatrical quality of the disclosure, are all consistent with the Bolton understanding that power is not merely possessed but performed, that the demonstration of power requires an audience and a presentation. Roose Bolton did not merely kill Robb Stark. He staged the killing, arranged its elements, chose its setting and its timing and its accompanying soundtrack in a way that maximized its communicative effect. This is the Bolton philosophy operating at its fullest expression, using the occasion not merely to end an enemy, but to produce a message, a permanent piece of political communication that would be received and understood by every lord in the Seven Kingdoms. The silence that followed the Red Wedding across the north was not empty. It was full of the specific kind of knowledge that changes the emotional architecture of the people who carry it. Every northern lord who received the news, every servant and soldier and farmer who heard it through the chain of word of mouth that carries information across a vast and isolated territory, each of them received not just news but a lesson, a painful and permanent education in what the world they lived in was actually willing to permit. This lesson entered the North's collective memory and stayed there, changing the climate of the culture as surely as any change in weather. What Sansa does with this loss is what Sansa does with everything. She files it away in the internal architecture that she has been building piece by piece since her father's death, the architecture of the person she is becoming, which is harder and more calculating and more patient than the girl who arrived in King's Landing with romantic ideas about chivalry and princes. The Red Wedding makes Sansa into something, adds to the construction of her, in the way that the worst experiences sometimes add rather than subtract. When Sansa eventually comes to the north again, when she stands within the influence of the Dreadfort as Ramsay Bolton's wife in the most degraded circumstances of her life, she's not the girl who sang songs in Winterfell. She's someone who knows what the Red Wedding means, who carries the loss of everyone she loved in a specific way, who understands the Boltons in a way that no Stark before her could understand them, because she has lived inside them. And this knowledge, this hard-won, devastatingly costly knowledge, is what makes Sansa Stark in her later form the most dangerous thing in the North. The Boltons showed her exactly what they were. Showing someone exactly what you are, when that person is as intelligent and as patient as Sansa, is the last mistake you make. Jon Snow will eventually hold the sword, but the intelligence driving the reconquest of the North lives in Sansa Stark's careful, patient, uncrossable memory of everything the Boltons did. The Red Wedding has passed through the story now. It is behind us, fixed in the past, permanent in the way that acts become permanent when they are witnessed and remembered. The night around you is very still. What was done cannot be undone. But the story is not finished. The North remembers. The night is patient. The reckoning has not yet arrived. Let your breath be very slow now. Let your body claim the rest that the night is offering. You are warm. You are safe. Your watch, for now, is ended. Roose Bolton created something in Ramsay that even he could not fully control. A son who wore his father's philosophy like a second skin, and wore it, unlike his father, with joy. Breathe slowly now. The night has grown very deep, and you are very far into it. That comfortable depth where the boundary between the story and the dream becomes permeable, where the history you are hearing begins to take on the quality of something half-remembered rather than newly learned. This is the right state. This is the state we have been building toward through all the hours of this telling. We come now to the most difficult presence in the Bolton story. Not the most historically significant. That distinction belongs to the lineage itself, to the 1,000-year war and the ancient philosophy. Not the most politically consequential. That distinction belongs to Roose, to the strategic intelligence that shaped the Red Wedding and the Northern occupation. but the most difficult, in the sense of the hardest to look at steadily. The presence in the Bolton story that represents something unlike anything else in the great narrative. Ramsay Snow, later Ramsay Bolton. I want to approach him carefully tonight, as I have promised to approach all of this carefully. Not with sensationalism, not with the breathless recitation of his acts, but with the genuine desire to understand what he is and where he came from, and what he means within the long story of his house. Because Ramsay does not exist in a vacuum. He is produced by something. He is the culmination of something, an understanding that something is part of what this long night's work is for. Ramsay's origins are not noble in any conventional sense. He was born outside the formal structures of legitimacy, the son of Roose Bolton and a woman of no particular status from the land surrounding the Dreadfort. He was raised by his mother until her death, growing up on the Bolton lands without formal acknowledgement from his father, inhabiting that particular social position that the world of Westeros designates as bastard, the child of blood without the protection of name, visible to the world as someone who belongs to a household but is not quite part of it. The specific psychology of bastard status in Westeros is a subject that the great story explores with considerable nuance. Jon Snow's experience of it at Winterfell, the sense of exclusion that coexists with inclusion, the name you do not carry, and the belonging you cannot quite complete. For Ramsay, whose nature was already oriented toward the expression of power through the control and diminishment of others, this position was not merely painful. It was formative in the most specific sense. It focused what was already present in him, gave it a direction, shaped it into the particular form of cruelty that would define him. The bastard who is excluded becomes the lord who excludes. The child who had no power becomes the adult who is interested, above everything else, in the possession of absolute power over others. When he eventually made his way to his father, Roose Bolton recognized him, not with the warmth of paternal love, but with the recognition that passes between two people who understand each other. Roose saw in Ramsay the Bolton inheritance in a form he could work with. The cruelty was present, the desire for domination was present, the particular relationship to other people's suffering was present. What Ramsay needed was direction. What Roose could provide was structure. The arrangement they entered into was unusual, Roose legitimizing his bastard son, eventually making him heir despite having other options. But it was, in Roose's characteristic way, a calculation about utility. Ramsay was useful. He was very good at certain things that needed doing. Roose was willing to invest in useful things. Here is what is worth sitting with about Ramsay Bolton. The difference between him and his father, which is substantial, is not a difference in values. They share the same fundamental values, the Bolton values, the values of the Dreadfort, the understanding that power over others is the highest good, and that empathy is a structural weakness. What is different is the relationship to experience. Roose Bolton experiences the exercise of Bolton power as a professional matter, something to be done well and efficiently without excess, calibrated to achieve maximum effect with minimum waste. He is, in his cruelty, a craftsman. Ramsay experiences it differently. This is the thing that both fascinates and disturbs observers of his character, the thing that makes him, in some ways, more unsettling than his father despite being less powerful. Ramsay enjoys it. He takes pleasure in it, a genuine sensory pleasure, the way that a person with a natural talent for something feels pleasure when that talent is expressed. The hunts, in which Ramsay pursues prey through the northern forests, are not strategic. They are not useful in any political sense. They are leisure. They are what Ramsay does for enjoyment. This introduces something into the Bolton philosophy that the philosophy in its original form did not quite contain. The original Bolton ideology was about power and effectiveness. Cruelty was a tool, effective, carefully used, always in the service of something else. Ramsay short-circuits this relationship. For him, The cruelty is not in the service of anything else. It is the thing itself. Roose understands this distinction and is troubled by it, in the limited way that Roose is capable of being troubled. He knows that Ramsay's appetites are not calibrated to political reality. He knows that a son who makes his enemies personal in ways that generate long-term political costs is not, in the strict calculation, a good investment. But Ramsay is also, when properly directed, extraordinarily effective. He achieves things that a more restrained agent could not. And the Dreadfort's particular specialty, the transformation of a person over time, Ramsay practices with a skill that suggests deep native understanding rather than mere training. The father kept the monster in a box. The box was always going to break open eventually. The transformation of Theon Greyjoy into Reek is the clearest and most sustained example in the great story of what the Bolton philosophy looks like when applied to a specific person over time. Theon arrives at the Dreadfort as a complicated young man, compromised, guilty, carrying the weight of things he has done that cannot be undone but still himself. He has a history, a name, a set of memories that constitute the texture of his identity. He has weaknesses, and Ramsay understands weaknesses the way his ancestors understood the terrain of the Weeping Water, with an intimate familiarity that comes from long study. The process Ramsay applies to Theon is not simple or quick. It proceeds in stages, each stage designed to erode a specific element of what makes Theon Theon. The physical elements first. Pain as a constant, unpredictable presence, neither explained nor consistent, forcing the mind to spend its resources on managing the immediacy of physical experience rather than on the maintenance of identity. Then the relational elements, the denial of his name, the replacement of it with Reek, the consistent refusal to recognize the self that the name represents, until the self begins to question whether the name was ever real. Then the social elements, the isolation from everyone who knew him as Theon, the creation of a new social reality in which Reek is the only identity available, the only one that's ever acknowledged. Theon Greyjoy is not destroyed in any physical sense. He is, in the most disturbing possible way, preserved, kept alive with sufficient care to remain functional, to be useful, to perform the tasks assigned to him. What is destroyed, systematically and over time, is the thread back to who he was. What the Bolton method produces is not a corpse, but something that breathes and moves and responds and has forgotten, or has been made to forget that there is another way to be. This is the Bolton endgame. This is what those ancient rooms were always built for. Not death. Death is the obvious ending, the one anyone can deliver. The Dreadfort's specialty was something more ambitious. The continuity of the body in the absence of the self. The creation of a person who is present without being there. That Theon eventually finds his way back. That something in him holds, through all of it, some thread back to himself, thin as a filament but unbreakable, is one of the quiet miracles of the great story. Sansa Stark sees what Theon has become and understands it in the specific way that someone who has experienced, in a different form, the attempt to unmake her can understand it. She does not see a traitor. She does not see the man who betrayed her brother and her home. She sees someone who has been through something she recognizes as a category. The attempt to reduce a person to nothing, to replace who they are with who the Bolton family wants them to be. This recognition is what makes possible what happens next. The alliance, fragile and desperate but real, between Sansa and Theon in the worst circumstances of both their lives. Theon holds on to Sansa's hand in the moment when she needs someone to hold on to, and in holding on to her he holds on to himself, the thread back to who he was pulling taut enough to bear weight. The specific relationship between Ramsay and his dogs is one of the more illuminating details in the entire Bolton story, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment as a window into Ramsay's psychology. Ramsay kept a pack of hunting dogs, given names, female names, treated with a species of care that was entirely absent from his treatment of people. This inversion, the cruelty directed toward human beings, the tenderness directed toward animals, is not accidental or incidental. It expresses something specific about the Bolton relationship to loyalty and to control. The dogs were loyal because they were bred and trained to be loyal. Their loyalty was a property, an engineered quality, reliable because it had been designed to be reliable. People were different. People had interior lives that could not be bred out of them, could not be trained into perfect compliance, could not be fully controlled however thorough the attempt. This is why Ramsay was interested in people in the way he was, not as relationships, not as connections, but as problems. Problems of the gap between what he wanted and what they were. Problems of will and resistance and the question of how far a self could be pushed before it stopped being itself. The dogs raised no such problems. They were, in their way, what the Bolton philosophy wished all people could be made to become. Reliable instruments, perfectly controllable, loyal until the loyalty itself became the instrument of their master's end. That the dogs eventually served as the instrument of Ramsay's own ending carries a poetic weight that is hard to overlook. Jon Snow, when he eventually encounters Theon after everything, does not fully understand. Jon's relationship to Theon is complicated by the history they share, the long shadow of what Theon did in those early years of the war. But Jon has been through enough of his own unmaking. His death, his return, the experience of loss so complete it requires a kind of reconstruction. To not be entirely alien to what Theon carries, they find, in the end, a kind of understanding that does not require the complete history to be resolved. Some things can be laid aside without being forgiven. What the Reek episode adds to the Bolton story is this: the moment when the philosophy pushed too far and broke the very thing it was using. Theon, reconstructed, eventually plays a role in the reclamation of the North. Not a decisive role, not the role of a hero, but a true role, a role that matters. He carried the name Reek and came back from it. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, a refutation of the Bolton philosophy's central claim, that the self can be entirely unmade if the process is thorough enough. It cannot. Something holds. And what holds in Theon Greyjoy, that stubborn remainder of the self that would not dissolve, is the beginning of the end for the Boltons. Ramsay's story is not finished yet. There is one more movement remaining. But we can pause here, in the deep of the night, and let what we have learned settle into its proper place. Let your body be entirely still. Let your thoughts move slowly, like the weeping water in winter, when it is almost ice, moving, but barely, with the patience of things that have learned to persist through cold. The reckoning is coming, but first, rest. Your watch, for now, is ended. And so, after 10,000 years of Bolton history, after the wars and the philosophy and the Red Wedding and the dungeon rooms, it came down to two men on a frozen field outside Winterfell, a Stark and a Bolton, as it always had to be. We are very near the end now, not the end of the night. The night is still ample, still generous, still wrapped around you like the most patient of companions. But the end of the Bolton story, the conclusion of everything we have been following through these long hours of history and darkness, the end of a line that stretches back further than memory can reach. Let your breathing be very slow now, in and out and in. There is something that happens at the conclusion of a very long story, a quality of settling, like the last note of music that has been playing for a long time, the moment when the final sound begins to fade, and what replaces it is not silence exactly, but the presence of what the music has left behind. That is where we're going. We're going to the field outside Winterfell. We're going to the Battle of the Bastards, which is what the histories of the world beyond the story came to call it, though within the story it has other names, other weights. We're going to the moment when everything that was built at the Dreadfort and at the Twins, and in the long centuries between them, was finally asked to answer for itself. When the North remembered loudly enough that the memory became action, let your body sink into the warmth beneath you. We are almost home. Jon Snow returns from death, which is a sentence that requires a moment of its own, the simple enormity of it worth acknowledging before moving past. He returns from death in the peculiar way that the great story allows for certain figures through the intervention of powers that move beneath the surface of the world, powers that have their own purposes and their own understanding of what the story requires. He returns as a man who's been through something that no human language was built to describe, and he returns changed, stripped of something, or perhaps freed of something, the certainty that the story has a fair outcome replaced by the bleaker and more powerful certainty that the story continues regardless. The gathering of forces that becomes the army of the Reclamation is a process that the great story describes with considerable care and considerable compassion. Jon is not a natural politician. He is a soldier, a leader in the particular northern sense of the word, a man whom other men follow because of what they see in him, rather than because of the strategic advantages he offers. The wildlings follow him because he died for them, because he made a choice on their behalf that cost him everything, and they understand what that kind of choice means better than most. The few northern lords who agree to ride with him come in their small numbers for similarly personal reasons. The Boltons, in contrast, command a fully equipped professional army. Ramsay has the Dreadfort's garrison, the forces of the northern houses he has bent to his service, and the military resources of a house that has just spent a season consolidating its hold on the largest territory in the Seven Kingdoms. On paper, on any rational assessment of the material balance of forces, the outcome of the confrontation should not be close. What the material assessment does not include is the quality of motivation, and the question of what people fight for when they fight not for a lord's command but for something older and more personal. The men who ride with Jon Snow are not fighting because they have been told to, or because the strategic calculus favours victory. They are fighting because of the Red Wedding, because of what was done to Robb Stark and his host, because of what Ramsay Bolton has done in the north, the visible, public, theatrical performance of Bolton power in its rawest and most undisguised form. They are fighting because the north remembers, and because remembering has finally reached the point where it demands expression. The battle itself is, at its heart, a reversal, a mirror image of everything the Boltons have historically done. Ramsay Bolton's strategy on the field is to use Jon Snow's emotional investment against him, to provoke a reaction, to force a charge before the moment is right, to use the psychological tools that the Bolton family has been cultivating for 10,000 years. He does this by killing Rickon Stark in front of Jon's eyes, by engineering the precise emotional trigger that will break Jon's tactical discipline and send the northern forces into the killing ground he has prepared. It works. Jon charges. The moment that was not supposed to happen, happens, exactly as Ramsay planned. This is, in microcosm, the Bolton method at its most refined, understanding the emotional architecture of your opponent and applying precise pressure to the point of collapse. Ramsay has read Jon Snow correctly. Jon Snow's love for his family, for the Starks who have been destroyed and diminished by everything the Boltons did, is the lever. Ramsay presses it, and Jon Snow charges into the killing ground that Ramsay prepared, and the battle goes wrong, and the northern forces are in danger of destruction. This is the Bolton philosophy in action, as effective as it has ever been. The manipulation of someone else's emotional reality as a weapon, the use of their deepest investment against them. Here is the thing worth sitting with. The Bolton method failed at the moment of its greatest success. Because the thing that Ramsay pressed to break Jon Snow, the love for family, the grief for the lost, the loyalty that makes northern men fight when they should retreat, is not actually a weakness. It is the thing that brings the Vale Knights through the mountain passes. It is the thing that Sansa Stark, who has understood more about the Boltons than anyone alive and has been planning more carefully than anyone knew, had already put in motion through her letter to Littlefinger. The Bolton philosophy looked at the capacity to love, to grieve, to be moved by loyalty and connection, and called it a structural weakness. And in 1,000 specific tactical situations, over 10,000 years of Northern history, this assessment was correct. But in the largest strategic situation, in the question of what a culture builds over centuries, what it can call on in its moment of extremity, the capacity to love and to grieve and to be moved is not a weakness. It is the reservoir from which everything else is drawn. Let that rest in the quiet of the night. Let it be true without being argued. Ramsay Bolton dies at Winterfell, in the kennels of Winterfell specifically, which carries its own particular weight of symbol. He is brought there not by Jon Snow, whose hands are already red enough with the battle, but by Sansa Stark. And in that choice, the decision to let Sansa be the agent of the final act, the great story is saying something specific about who understood the Boltons most completely, and who therefore had the right to conclude the reckoning. Sansa Stark walks into the kennel where Ramsay is secured and speaks to him with the particular calm of someone who has been planning this conversation, in some interior sense, for a very long time. She tells him that his name will be forgotten. She tells him that his house is ended. She tells him, in language that is precise and unhurried, that the stories he told himself about what he was and what he had built are not true and will not last. And then she walks away, and the animals he had trained to be instruments of his cruelty do what they were bred to do. There is a specific poetic justice in the ending that is available to you if you have been following the Bolton story to its roots. The flayed man on the Bolton sigil says, "We have the power to unmake you, to strip away the boundary of yourself, to reduce you to what you are beneath the surface." The ending at Winterfell says, "The thing that unmakes you is already inside you, is already yours, was never as loyal to you as you believed." The weapon turns. The instrument does not distinguish between the intended target and the wielder, when the wielder's power is finally, completely gone. House Bolton ends in those kennels. Not with the grandeur that 10,000 years of history might seem to warrant, not with the drama of a climactic battle or the formal ceremony of a house's extinction. It ends in the cold and the dark, with a woman who is calm because she's been patient, because she has understood that patience is not weakness, and that the Boltons, who knew this too in their way, were not wrong about patience, only about everything else. The flayed man comes down from the walls of Winterfell. The stark direwolf goes back up. The stone of the castle is the same stone it has always been. Old, cold, patient, deeply rooted in the earth of the north. The end of House Bolton is not, in the immediate political sense, a resolution of everything the house represented. The philosophy does not die with Ramsay. The Dreadfort still stands. The memory of what was done there, the institutional knowledge of how to use fear as architecture. That knowledge does not simply evaporate because the last Bolton is dead in the kennel yard. What dies is the line, the blood, the continuity, the specific dynasty through which the Bolton philosophy expressed itself and reproduced itself across the generations. Sansa Stark, in the aftermath, becomes the person who holds the North together. She has been shaped by the Boltons in ways that cannot be entirely undone. The Dreadfort, the occupation, the specific education in the nature of power that the Bolton experience provided, not intentionally but inevitably. She carries that education, she uses it, not in the same way, not toward the same ends, but the understanding of how power can be hidden, how appearances can be managed, how patience can be weaponized. These are tools she has, and they come from the school of her suffering. The North that rebuilds itself after the Bolton occupation is a North that has been changed by the experience, more suspicious than it was, more careful, more aware of the gap between what people present and what they are. In a terrible way, the Boltons have left the North with something they did not intend to leave, a hardness, a wariness, a refusal to be completely fooled again. Whether this is a gift or a wound is a question the North will be answering for a long time. Jon Snow rides beyond the wall, eventually carrying his own impossible inheritance in the other direction, and the North watches him go and keeps its own counsel. The Vale cavalry that arrives through the mountain passes to turn the tide of the battle is not, on the surface, a Bolton story. It is a story about Littlefinger's calculation and Sansa's decision to trust it. But it is also, in a deeper sense, a Bolton story. Because the letter that Sansa wrote, the decision she made to reach out and the direction she reached in, was made by someone who had been educated in the Bolton school. Sansa had learned, from the Boltons, that resources exist in unexpected places, that the capacity to wait is the capacity to win, that the moment of action should be chosen with the same care that Roose Bolton chose the night of the Red Wedding. She didn't learn these things because she admired the Boltons. She learned them because she survived them. The Bolton story is complete now, from the Red Kings and their ancient fortress, through the 1,000 Years' War and the forced submission, through the philosophy of the flayed man and the dungeons below the weeping water, through the quiet monster Roose made and the louder one he fathered, through the Red Wedding and the occupation and the battle on the frozen field and the kennel yard at Winterfell. It has all been told. You have travelled 10,000 years in a single night. You have carried the weight of the North's longest and darkest secret through the dark, and now it can be set down. The history will keep, as history always keeps, patient, fixed, available to whoever comes looking in the morning. But morning is some hours away yet, and you have the whole of the night still with you. Let your thoughts grow very slow now, like water nearly ice. Let your breathing find its deepest rhythm. The stories of the North will be waiting when you wake. The North remembers, and now so do you. Your watch, for tonight, is ended. If this story of the Dreadfort kept you company through the night, subscribe to Factonium, Facts Unlocked. Every week another corner of this world opened quietly, carefully, for you. If you made it here, if this history of the most feared house in Westeros kept you company through the dark, let me know where in the world you are watching from, and what time it is where you are. I am always curious about that, and if there is a house, a war, or a forgotten figure whose story you want to hear next, leave it in the comments. The Dreadfort will keep. The stories will keep. Until next time, your watch is ended.